session. I'm your host this afternoon, and my name is Lucille Webster. We're going to continue with our theme that we had earlier this afternoon. The second part of the conference will look at understanding the impact. The first one was to explore digital disruption. So we've got quite interesting papers for you and speakers as well. Our first speaker is going to be Tyler Shores. He's the manager of the Think Lab program within the Strategic Partnership Office at the University of Cambridge. His research focuses upon reading in print, reading on screens, and digital distraction and attention spans. Tyler's current projects are focused on digital well-being, social media, and the role of digital technology in our everyday lives. Prior to Cambridge, Tyler worked at the Google in Mountain View, California, as part of the Authors at Google, one of the world's largest online lecture series. In addition, he has worked as a director of digital textbooks in the field of nonprofit education, and most recently worked as a manager in online education at the Stanford University. Please join me in welcoming Tyler. We're absolutely looking forward to his presentation. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining this session. I'm Tyler Shores. I am a senior research associate from the University of Cambridge and the manager of the Think Lab. And I'm here today to talk to you about libraries, readers, and digital distraction. So let's jump right into things. And I thought I would start with what originally got me interested in this topic. And it was a book from a journalist in the US called Nicholas Carr. It was a book called The Shallows. And I thought I would read this to kind of explain what it is I want to talk about today. I'm not thinking the way I used to think. I feel it most strongly when I'm reading. I used to find it easy to immerse myself in a book or a lengthy article. That's rarely the case anymore. Now my concentration starts to drift after a page or two. I get fidgety, lose the thread, begin looking for something else to do. The deep reading that used to come naturally has become a struggle. So this was from, like I mentioned, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, The Shallow. And eventually this sparked my own interest in this because I related to this very well. As someone who's been a heavy book reader for most of my life, I found that while I was immersed in the tech world and dancing between multiple screens and devices on a daily basis, that it was becoming harder to get into deep reading, that I found my attention span was becoming more flighty and these sort of things. Some of you might notice that too, amongst yourselves or amongst your readers. So I thought I would kind of situate this historically a little bit. So this was just one fun example. This is from The Atlantic, but here's the so-called book wheel. Some of you, if you've seen any book history stuff, this is exactly what it looks like. There's a real one right there. So it was a rotating book wheel, desk that you could kind of circulate between different articles and different reading types of materials. So the reason why I share this is because a lot of the questions that we have now about how technology is changing how we read, how our attention spans and our capacity to focus might be changing. The context is different, but a lot of the same questions still apply. There's a New York Times article, which I will share over on Twitter when I get a chance, about it wasn't that long time ago, not too long in the Victorian era, when we considered long novels to be bad for us. Anything, heaven forbid, things have pictures or cliffhanger endings between chapters and these sort of things. These were what we now think of as exemplars of deep reading, immersive reading. Back then were considered similar to now. So similar to the kind of worries that we have about social media and reading, war novels contributing to shorter attention span and the breakdown of society and these sort of things. So old questions, new contexts, and new ways in which we're asking these questions. I thought I'd talk a little bit about distraction, because distraction is a hard topic to research for a number of reasons. First of all, it's kind of, there's not a one-size-fits-all definition for all people. I'm interested in distraction in the context of reading. We all have different distraction tolerances. Some of us like crowded spaces, coffee shops, when coffee shops used to be a thing to read, having that background murmur when it comes to reading. Some of us like the quiet of a library, a quiet corner somewhere. The other interesting thing too is that there's variation across different people. There's also variation in terms of distraction tolerance amongst individual people. So you and I might be For leisure reading, maybe we're in a certain mood, or maybe it's a certain time of day that we want to do lighter reading that works for us in a coffee shop and background murmur and people watching and all of these things. For more complicated reading, maybe we prefer the silence of being at home or a cozy library nook somewhere. Maybe it depends on the time of day, our chronotype, what kind of person we are, more of a morning person, morning lark, or a night owl. So this is just something to consider, that distractions do vary from person to person, from culture to culture, and even within amongst ourselves. Coming from the tech side of things, I thought I would mention a few points on digital distractions, because this is something that I'm particularly interested in. I often get this question, so I thought I would share a couple of points here. How much time are we spending online? Some of our friends at my friends at the BBC Research and Development team have shared a few stats. So it depends. It depends on age group. It depends on the kind of work you do. Distractions have certainly changed since COVID, when we're spending more time on screens than we have at any previous time. These are some numbers I've seen. I've seen a lot of variety with this. My own research has gotten a range of different things. So here in this middle slide from the BBC, they've figured somewhere between 150 pickups per day. So a pickup is anything, even if you're using it as your phone as a clock just to check things or to very quickly. We're doing it about 150 times on average. As you can see, it varies by audience. So adults, teens, that's many hours a day spending things online across multiple devices. Here's an even different one. So again, it depends on what we need. This is from Gloria Mark at the University of California, Irvine. Apologies for the slides, a little illegible, but she's been doing research on work patterns when it comes to distractions and screen switching. What her research has shown within the last few years is that we switch screens. Typical workers switch screens up to 566 times a day. I know that number seems sort of staggering, but what that means is, for example, while I'm talking to you, this is one screen. While you're listening to me, you might do a quick glance at your phone to see if you have any notifications. That's 2 screen switches right there. So just imagine that over the course of the day, how many times you do that, how many times they check email, almost 80 times per day, checking Facebook almost 40 times per day. So this is one segment of the population, but how digitally distracted are we? How frequently? The answer seems to be a lot, but it depends. There are different degrees of digital distractions, which I want to talk about as well. I often think about this too, and coming from the tech side of things, the important thing to remember is it's not so much, and I often hear this from people too, complaining about having bad attention spans, being terrible at multitasking, and all of these things. I hope we can give ourselves a break a little bit. Like, it's not entirely our fault that we have these habits. All the apps and interfaces that we use now are intentionally constructed this way. The reason why Facebook notifications are this shade of red, the reason why they have things vibrate this way, the reason why they use those icons, it's because they've had an army of engineers and psychologists go through and figure what is going to make us click on this thing. So that's why user design, has a lot to do with how distracted we are. And there are ways that we can kind of figure out what triggers us, what is distracting in terms of what leads us most likely to get out of the reading habits or the modes, the things that we're trying to pay attention to. I thought I would call special attention to a couple of things. On this middle graphic here, that's infinite scroll. So infinite scroll is something I'm particularly worried about. Infinite scroll is exactly what it sounds like. It originated in Google, actually, and it was a way to make websites load faster. So rather than click, 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 you scroll, scroll, scroll. And, for our intents and purposes, it is infinite. You just keep scrolling and scrolling. What I've certainly noticed, both personally and in my research, is there's certainly a curve of diminishing returns when it comes to infinite scroll. The longer we're on it, and you're familiar with infinite scroll if you use TikTok, Reddit, Twitter, YouTube, all of these things that you can kind of just keep scrolling and scrolling, and at some point it becomes a little bit mind-numbing. The more mind-numbed we get and the less engaged we become with this, the worse we tend to feel with that. So these are the kind of things that I say, not all distractions are created equal. Some of them are more distracting than others, and it depends. So being aware, I would say, to give a practical tip, is just sort of being aware, what are the things that you find most distracting? Phone calls for me, I find incredibly distracting. So I try to turn my phone off during times of getting ready for talks or having to do research or important writing of these sort of things. But being mindful of the very different ways that we are distracted and trying to find ways to kind of minimize our exposure to that. What does that have to do with reading and our reading habits? So there's a few interesting things that have come up recently. Marianne Wolf is a neuroscientist based in the US, and she wrote this interesting article for The Guardian about skim reading. And she makes a bigger point about this too, which I'm going to cover in just a second. But the idea is, has skim reading become our default? And it depends. Again, are we talking about skim reading when it comes to news articles? There's more news articles in the course of a day that we possibly hope to read. So we start being strategic about how we read things. Skimming is okay. There are different ways, different approaches to thinking about these things. The kind of reading, and we don't read in all of the same ways, in all of the same contexts. How we read a news article on our phone while we're walking somewhere is much different than we would if we're sitting at home with a book, a printed book, with less distractions around us. Reading and attention spans, the best way I could sum some of these things up, the kind of so what questions is this. And I think it is important. This is a funny way to present it, but I also feel like there's a lot of like bigger picture truths to reflect on this. So this is the TLDR. This is the too long didn't read that some of you might have seen on the internet. And these are the logical extensions about very short, still didn't read, read a bit, got bored, missed the point. And really the last one is the kicker, in my opinion. The red headline, posted angry comments. So this is kind of what Marianne Wolf and other researchers like myself are getting at, that short attention spans do matter. Reading and attention spans do matter, not because we're simply not reading as much as we could in terms of words during the course of a day, but what is it doing to our tolerance for ambiguity, our commitment to actually being, our capacity for boredom, our actual empathy? Are we more distracted and therefore less able to tolerate things that don't entertain us? So that's what RHPAC means. That's the one, and we know this is a real thing, of course. We've seen Twitter build in reminders before you share or retweet an article. Some of you might notice, or have you read this article first before you share it? Interesting to see things, platforms like Twitter and other social media evolve with our habits. We'll see what it means, but these are some things to keep in mind. I'm also interested in multitasking behavior in reading. So there have been a number of studies. I will share some links to these studies in case you're interested. We multitask a lot. This was with students in particular, in this case, that they were only able to stay on task during the course of a 10 or 15 minute period, about every 5 minutes. So their attention span was roughly, when it came to studying or doing work and staying on task, every 5 minutes or so. It's not just students. Those of us older generations didn't fare much better. I think we lasted 7 or 8 minutes on average in some of the follow-up studies that they've done about this. So we're multitasking a lot. Multitasking, again, can mean multiple things. Multitasking itself is a bit of a misnomer. Multitasking is really task switching. And the vast majority of the population, statistically speaking, it's both you and I, are bad at multitasking. As in, when we multitask and we switch from something, as for example, listening to a talk while answering an email, we're probably going to end up doing both of those things slower and more poorly than we would if we were concentrating on one thing at a time. So multitasking is a bad deal for us when it comes to reading and doing our tasks and things. I often encounter this question about our attention spans. Like I mentioned earlier about reading, people expressing concern about their attention spans. What if I have a short attention span? Can these sort of things be fixed? Again, it depends. My answer is, from personal experience and also just what I've seen, yes. Like in the same way that we've had short attention spans crop up because we've been training our brain to constantly check things and dip in and out, we can also train our brains in the reverse way. Me personally, I like audiobooks, and I'd recommend this for most people. You'd be surprised what getting lost in a good book does for your attention span. All of a sudden, there isn't that need to check notifications or keep checking email 80 times a day. I think audiobooks, a good narrator, a good story that actually helps you get lost in a good book is a great way to improve your attention span. That's a personal tip more than anything else. On the reader and studying side of things, I thought I would share just a couple of studies which are interesting. Talking about reading and writing and thinking all together, there have been a number of studies that show, for example, when it comes to note taking, what's the best way to take notes? Well, what counts as the best way to take notes? Digital and typing might be faster, but faster isn't always better. We've done a couple of studies in the US and the UK about taking notes during classes. Retention seems to be better when you write them down physically on a piece of paper rather than typing. We type faster than we can write, obviously, but sometimes when we write, we slow things down and have to put things into our own words. And that's actually an important part of learning and memory consolidation. Sometimes slower is better. There's another general tip that I find is that to ward off distractions, I call it the kind of the knee-jerk wanting to look something up sort of thing. So I often keep just a pencil and paper nearby to kind of like, rather than jump to a new task, if I'm in the middle of something, I will just write something down. And generally from my experiences, after 5, 10, 30 minutes, half of the time, I don't really care about what it is that I wanted to look up earlier. And this is kind of built into our human brains a little bit, part of our psychology. We kind of crave distractions and stimuli sometimes. So even if we don't, it may seem important in the moment to look something up, and it may not be, but that's just kind of how our brain tends to work. And knowing how to work within those limitations is actually a good way to not beat ourselves up over these sort of things. From the library side of things, there's certainly been more in terms of reading metrics, right? So you've probably seen things, whether it's in Medium or different kinds of articles, estimated reading times for articles, which is, it's telling. They're taking this based on the average reading speed, which I forget what's considered the average now, 175 words per minute. So this is the idea, and they just take the number of words and divide by that. So it's an interesting way to see that there's so many articles, like now we start seeing this built in. Is this worth someone's time to read, to spend 3 minutes on? I don't know about 3 minutes. Well, I can do 3 minutes. I don't know about 9 minutes or 11 minutes or these sort of things. But what does that mean? From a library and a researcher and an educational standpoint, what does minutes read actually mean? And the experience of reading is tricky. This is one of my favorite novels, by the way, Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler. And it is a book. It's a metafiction book, so it's a little bit wacky, but it is a book about a reader reading this book. And the quote here, which I'll read out, is, "Reading is always this. There is a thing that is there, a thing made of writing, a solid material object which cannot be changed. And through this thing, we measure ourselves against something else that is not present, something else that belongs to the immaterial, invisible world, because it can only be thought, imagined, or because it was once and is no longer past, lost, attainable." I feel like that's a good description of the reading experience, because it is terribly hard to capture the reading experience. Like, we can go based on number of pages read, but it's much harder, short of, we've seen studies with fMRIs and these sort of things now, like putting people in MRI tubes and having them read Jane Austen novels, like what's actually going on in the mind of the reader during the act of reading. And that's hard. There are different ways that tech is trying to catch up with this. Jelly Books is a UK-based company that works with all of the big publishers like Penguin Random House and others. And essentially, it's interesting to see how they do things, but they'll keep track of things such as looking into an ebook file and seeing what are our reading sessions like. So if you look at this slide here on the right-hand corner, the top and the bottom one, each block represents a duration, blue block represents a duration of time in a reading session. So we can kind of see someone used the app, read for about 10, 15, 20 minutes, took a lunch break, read a little longer, minor interruption, longer than that, and then seeing that over the course of a day and seeing that over the course of a couple of weeks and months, seeing different reading habits, noticing when people read. So this is the kind of thing that publishers are doing now. This is the kind of thing that when things are being read on devices, that publishers get insight into what people are reading, how long they're reading, when they're reading. It tells us something. It tells us something about reading behavior. I'll try to wrap up a few things with some practical tips and some recommendations if you're interested in these topics. Me personally, the app that I use for reading, so this is an anti-distraction app that syncs across your devices, so on your phone and on your laptop, so it's harder to cheat. But you can actually set times of non-internet or blocking certain websites. And I use this all the time, actually, just being able to share, carving out quiet time, whether it's in the morning to actually focus on creative things or catch up on leisure reading. I prefer it this way. I prefer not having notifications. Notifications can wait more often than not. Very seldom, even in the kind of work that I do, is anything absolutely urgent last minute required. So carving out that quiet reading time is nice. I share some tips on how I actually do that when it comes to reading and writing habits and avoiding distractions. And another underrated one, for those of you that use Apple devices, iOS or Mac OS, there are shortcuts. There are reading shortcuts, which I feel like are super underrated. I don't know why this doesn't get talked about that often, but they're built into the app software operating system itself. And then with a click, it'll actually turn your phone into airplane mode, open up your reading app of choice, or open up your reading list or bookmarks and say, like, we're going to turn everything else off other than the reading apps for 10 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever. I love those kind of things. I love seeing that they're starting to automate these things and give our habits a little nudge in the right direction. I talked before about our natural ebb and flow of attention spans and how sometimes we do crave boredom. For some of you, or for students, this might be useful if you've heard of the Pomodoro technique. The general idea is a period of work, usually about 25 minutes of work concentrated on one thing, and then a 5-minute break to do whatever. So that could very easily be adopted to reading time to build up your reading habits or these sort of things. To actually be able to say is like, okay, and start small. Start small with, like, let's try 10 minutes of just reading, no checking notifications and social media, take a break, and then building from there. That's something I recommend to students very often. So I'll leave in a couple of notes. I've talked about some of the historical context of distraction. I really liked this book by Natalie Phillips. So and she talks about 18th century literature and what counts as distraction. Distraction isn't always simply just a scientific measurable phenomenon. It's also something that's culturally situated and that's shaped over time. What counts as distracted? What counts as a good or a bad attention span? It's interesting to see that. It's interesting to see, I'll share a link to the article on the right here, that how we think about things and what distraction is, the morality behind it in terms of, like, are we too distracted? Is this good or bad? Maybe it's neither. Maybe it's just simply part of life and we're noticing it more because of quantity, but we're also learning ways to evolve with this. A couple of books that I would share, closing slide here. Marianne Wolf, I've talked about before. She has a lovely book written up in terms of how our brains, so she's a neuroscientist and she talks about the different ways, the history of the reading brain, all the way up to our habits and what digital technology might be doing to it, and also ways that our brains might be adapting to digital reading and habits, both for the good and for the bad. Naomi Wolf's book, Naomi Barron's book, Words on Screen, is also an excellent one. Talks about her studies across different countries and how different readers might have different preferences between paper and digital screen reading. And then David Owen's book, The Lost Art of Reading. He is a book editor for the Los Angeles Times, who wrote this book that I thought was quite good. It kind of gives an overview of both the good and the bad of digital reading habits. That's it. I think that's all the time we have for today. So I will leave with that. We'll share the links on Twitter for you all to collect any of those articles later. Feel free to get in touch over email or my website or various social media things. And with that, I think we'll wrap things up and we'll have time for question and answers afterwards. Thanks.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lindiwe Soizwapi. I'm the director at the University of Pretoria, Department of Library Services. So today I'm talking to you about the renewed mission for engagement to enhance discovery of information resources, a case of the University of Pretoria. So this is just an outline of my talk for today, where I'll just be giving a bit of background. I'll be affirming the need for academic libraries to be aligned to institutional vision. And then I'll give a bit of context on my take on engagement, how we engage with the university community. So with the changes that have faced us during the pandemic, we really needed to be informed about what was being said at a national level as a regulatory environment. We needed to be in tune with what was happening locally and the priorities as they were shifting in our institutions. And then I'll focus my talk on the engagement that we had within our institution. And then I'll conclude. So to start off, I just want to affirm that academic libraries pride themselves of alignment to institutional priorities. And also we pride ourselves of being responsive to the user needs as they change over time. And these needs inform and shape the library's programs and offerings that we make available to the university community. So I'm just pointing out three broad changes that we are continuously faced with in libraries. Changes in ICTs, and also changes that happen in ICT outside of our environment in higher education, but that inform our users, shifts our users' needs and their expectations, and even their preferences. There are changes in the research environment. You know, previously there was greater emphasis on research occurring within particular disciplinary areas, and increasingly we're seeing multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary groupings. Changes happening in teaching and learning. And during COVID, this has really been our experience. So I'm going to be looking at the engagement that we needed to have. Actually, it was greater engagement, because previously we have been intentional about engaging with our university community, but because we needed to be clear about the shifts that were occurring and the needs and the pain points at this time, we needed to have deeper level of involvement with our users. So I'm just framing, just broadly, my take on engagement. It's when also users are able to share with us their lived experiences and their preferences. It's deliberate opportunities for engagement that we have with our community. And as library, we generally have forums where we do this. We have surveys that we conduct periodically. So I've given three broad areas. So where we are engaging with our users, it's when we have them as our partners on particular problem, on co-creation of products or services. We also engage when we actually want to hear the voices of our community, to just have a sense of their experiences, what their needs are. And the third example I'm showing is we engage during the learning process and the various programs that we offer, whether it's information literacy courses, research support courses that we provide. But for today's presentation, I'll be focusing on the voices that we want to hear from our community as a way of engaging. So during this time of COVID, we really needed to open our ears to the messages that were coming from national government. So the regulatory environment was also very important. From DHET, the messages were clear about saving the academic year and that no students should be left behind. So that was in a way informing what we were expected to do. The Council for Higher Education also had quality assurance guidelines that they shared. Although they did affirm that remoteness is not an appropriate pedagogy, but because of the health pandemic that we're in, you know, it's the best thing that we've got at the moment. But then they pointed out the need for greater student support, the need to develop capacity for staff, to take care of the wellness of staff, and for university to relook at formative and summative assessments. So as libraries, and also for us at the University of Pretoria Library, it was important to then understand what was the institutional interpretation of this emergency remote learning. In what form was it going to take? There was confirmation it was going to be online. There were teaching and learning guidelines that were shared. And we're transitioning from a blended environment to a fully online environment. There was a lot of terminology that we had to get used to. We knew that lectures were going to be streamed, but also students could choose to download them at a later stage and listen to them at that time. And that had an impact for us and in adjusting our offerings as a library. So clarity on user needs was important for us. Hence the need for the 3 studies that I'm going to be talking you through, because we needed to really not be driven by our gut feeling, but to be driven by the expressed needs of our community. And we're fortunate to get ethical clearance because ordinarily surveys are scheduled way in advance. We wouldn't have been given ethical clearance. So I'm going to talk us through the 3 studies that we conducted during this time. And the first one was the online library survey, where we wanted to gain a greater sense of the satisfaction levels with our digital library. We wanted also to establish the needs and understand the pain points, because our students and our staff were now in varied environments. We're no longer all operating from campus. We're all at our homes and at different locations. So this survey was sent to the whole UP population. It was open for a month and 903 participated. We were disappointed with this number of participants, but we were grateful because it offered us a dipstick of the needs and the voices. So 51% was, this is just a distribution to share the distribution. 51% was undergraduates, 24% was postgraduates, academic staff were 17%, and professional staff also responded to the survey. And this is also just to share with you the distribution across all our faculties. We have EBIT, which is the engineering faculty. It's our biggest enrollments. So it's quite good to see there was greater participation from the faculties as well. So what needs actually emerged from this study? The users told us clearly, so I've selected just 10, the top 10. So the users told us that our website was not easy to navigate. And for us, this was confirmation of what, as we were working on a revision of our website, refreshing of our website. So this information just came at the right time. There were issues and struggles around off-campus access. Some of our links were broken, so it wasn't clear whether it's resources we should have access to or it's resources where the links are genuinely broken and need attention. There was a lot of concerns around ebooks, especially around the limitations on the number of people who can access the books at the same time. And we are mindful of the big classes that we have in some of the modules. So it really is a pain point for our community. And the limitations on downloads, obviously you cannot download the whole book. There were concerns around past exam papers, although this is not a direct responsibility of the library, but because the service sits on our website, we really had to take this up with our partners. And there was a request for how-to resources, whether it's videos or just workbooks that students can work at their own pace. Other concerns were around prescribed textbooks. I think we're all aware that during this time of COVID, students who are funded by government, some of the funding was repurposed and redirected to buying laptops. So we saw from the responses and the pain points being access to prescribed textbook. But the related concern also is around issues of copyright. We also received recommended titles that we do not subscribe to, and there was an unhappiness about our turnaround point. and that needed attention. I will then move to the second survey that we conducted. We wanted to dig deeper into what needs the postgraduate students have. So the library, working together with the research office, runs a series of training workshops for our master's and doctoral students. So it was important for us to gain greater insight. So which were the pressing training needs during this time when students were working from home. So the population of this study was all our master's and doctoral candidates. The listserv was used to distribute the survey questionnaire. It ran for a month and 480 responses were received. So I just took the top express need to share with you today. Maximizing research impact. So this is around where do you publish? How do you vet the journals that you publish in? How do you make your research more visible? How do you track your citations? The second need was around academic writing and academic support, conducting literature review, conducting systematic review. It was interesting because our experience was that there was greater requests for support with systematic reviews. There were also needs for various research methodologies identified as another training need, and Microsoft Excel and the visualizing of data. So we then had to work together with our partners in the research office, the Graduate Support Hub, and the Writing Center to attend to these needs of our students. And the final study that we conducted was the usability testing. So this is generally a user experience methodology, and it was conducted by our UX units within the library. So the objective was to observe the behavior while participants were completing particular tasks that were given to them to search the digital library. It was also to find out if participants can find the resources that they were being directed to, and also to establish at what point they started to struggle. The population was a sample, and this sample was made up of undergraduate students, postgraduate students, and some of academic staff. It was conducted within a month. Ideally, this study would have been performed at our UX laboratory within the university in the Department of IT. But unfortunately, because of lockdown, it had to be conducted online. We're grateful to the department for providing the tools to do it online. So what did we find out from the study? It was 3 broad areas. It was around the design of our landing page. So here are some of the comments. The banner obscures the important information. It affirmed the prominence of contact numbers. And they were happy also that the ask and chat features were quite prominent. There were suggestions around functionality where the positioning and location of things like the search box. And with the part where the participants were observed, one of the interesting observations was that undergraduate students would scroll to the bottom of the page in search of the information they needed, but postgraduate students and staff members did not do that. So this was quite interesting for us. So obviously, having established those needs, we then took steps. Ideally, we would have wanted also to have some focus groups to drill down further into some of the needs where we're not quite clear about the struggles and the pain points. But because of lockdown, unfortunately, that wasn't possible. And complaints were really given priority and attended to. We had improvement plans put in place. Training that had been requested was offered. And we also had 2 long-term projects that came out of the feedback that we've received from the university community. So to conclude, I want to point out that the engagement was really informative. It gave us valuable insights and gave us confidence that the offerings that we make are based on expressed needs of our community. It informed our responses, and we had to reprioritize some of the things so that we're able to respond to the needs that were expressed. It also ignited conversations with stakeholders who also were interested in enhancing access for our students. We had interesting conversations even with our deputy vice chancellors for teaching and learning and also for research. We had conversations with deans around issues of copyright, limitations. We also had conversations with publishers to extend access for some of the resources. And internally, I can just share that the walls that separated us as units and the silos that existed were lowered or came down for a time. Obviously, we would be happy if those silos would disappear, but for now we can say they have come down and we're able to work together to a greater extent. And also we've seen greater collaboration with partners in faculties, with partners in academic departments, and also with partners also in professional services departments. And as a library, we are intentional about communicating more with our students, communicating more with the university community. And colleagues, I also would like to acknowledge the colleagues who've also conducted these studies. I'd like to acknowledge our Research Commons team, our marketing and quality assurance team, and our user experience team. Thank you very much, colleagues. You were able to assist us to gain greater understanding of the needs of our community. So thank you very much, colleagues. If you are interested in some of the readings I've used for this presentation, you'll find them at the bottom of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's absolute pleasure to be here today, presenting to you on my topic, Adapting Librarian Skills and Workflows to Survive in a New Normal World. Now, these days, librarian skills and library workflows have been challenged during the rise of the COVID-19 pandemic, and working from home and staying relevant to patrons and library users has become a hot topic in the library and information arena. Many of us thought that the pandemic would soon be a thing of the past, but we are coming to realize that many of the changes we have seen could be here to stay. We as librarians are adapting to a new normal. And during this session, we shall look at how we can adjust and refocus on what is important now. We shall also look at the librarian skills, new workflow processes, and how best we can evaluate what our needs are and how shall we apply the funds that are available to either move forward with print or electronic resources. And finally, the big question is where to from here. Heraclitus states that change is the only constant. In my view as a librarian, I have been most acceptable and most of us have been most acceptable to great adopters to change over decades. And the rise of technology, which is the growing digital age, the change in user behavior, the repurpose of library spaces, but to mention a few, has been part of our changing journey. We lived in a world where we can breathe fresh air and interact daily with other humans, not having to be concerned of sharing library books, spaces, or devices. This has changed drastically the past 16 months for many libraries. Once again, we as librarians need to rethink how we can be relevant and support our users best. Change is not new to us. We will get through this the same we did in the past, or maybe some of us have already found the solution, and I'm posing that to you as a question. Whilst many libraries are riding the wave, others are still battling to find the medium to get on the wave. And hopefully after this session, you will be able to consider options on how to move forward. I want to start by addressing the few questions as a guide in finding the answers. Why do we need to adjust and refocus? The obvious is the world is no longer operating as it used to prior to COVID-19. We can no longer assist and support our patrons in a physical space, but need to find alternative ways to still serve the same purpose. Or is it a different purpose? The worlds are governed by a new set of social interaction rules, which leaves librarians with a lot of thinking on how to stay relevant and render a service to its patrons and its users. Who need to adjust and refocus? Adjustment and refocus is not limited to the librarians only, but it is rather broad. In my view, all our stakeholders and library community need to adjust and refocus. Together, we are stronger. Now you may ask who our stakeholders and library communities are. That is basically everyone who have influence on the library or are impacted by the library. You can make the list, but to mention a few: faculty, your students, your patrons, your sponsors, the publishers, the vendors, and the list can go on and on. And libraries need to engage with the local community around to find synergies and to enhance that local community belonging feeling, which is needed for libraries to stay relevant for their communities. Now, the other question I have is what needs to be adjusted and refocused? There can be a very long list of what needs to be adjusted, but for now, let us highlight the very important ones. Since most patrons can only access information resources and library services from their home or virtually, one needs to look at the services and availing of e-resources. Basically, re-evaluate what type of resources are now more important to have within your library. Most libraries are hybrid, which means they have print and electronic collections. Thus, their budgets are also for print and electronic resources. With the pandemic, budgets are tighter or even cut, and librarians need to refocus and adjust how they will spend those budgets. Librarian skills and library workflows are other important factors to consider. With the change in how we service our patrons, workflows change and the skills librarians need may be impacted as well. Library spaces is another important target to adjust and refocus. If and when patrons or users are allowed back in libraries, the spaces need to be completely compliant to support the users. The trends these days are for maker spaces, innovation spaces, and as they are called in the Middle East, incubation spaces, and some other spaces like team spaces and other spaces that your users use to utilize these spaces. Now, when do we need to adjust and refocus? Some libraries have been on the forefront adopting new technologies, skills, and workflows pre the pandemic. These libraries were in a better position to make an electronic service shift faster than those libraries who are not there yet. Sometimes we get pushed by an incident, which in this case, the pandemic, to be a more proactive and of course, staying abreast of predicted change. My advice, adjust and refocus when you know your services are not what it used to be, and when you realize that your services had declined. There are factors such as funding, decision-making, those that decide on the funds, decision makers' input, manpower, the knowledge of the librarian, and of course, I could left out a few, and those can influence moving forward and how you as a library move forward. Now, where do we adjust and refocus? Change starts with the individual. If you're willing to adjust and refocus and adopt the changes and ride the wave, the rest will be easy to follow. Once all the individuals are in agreement to adjust and refocus, meaning that you start seeing the end goal first, then address the steps on how to get there. Now, how do we adjust and refocus? I shall share a few tips in the following slides on how to go about. I want to highlight some important factors to consider during the process, starting with the individual library, or the librarian rather. In the near future, 9 out of 10 jobs will require digital skills. But today, around half of the population do not have basic digital skills. Helping people develop the digital skills is a key goal for libraries. Libraries nowadays are providing infrastructure, education, and access to resources to keep their main mission of ensuring democratic access to information and knowledge through physical and virtual spaces. This might not be enough with one of the most challenging factors of the 21st century. And I want to drill this in, the digital divide. Libraries might need to work collaboratively with other organizations to overcome social and digital exclusion. The librarian must be more than a librarian. Similarly, as librarians need to change, workflows also need to change and be adjusted. Now, workflows differ based on the type of library and the number of staff in the library. The basic administrative workflows follow the pattern of most businesses or organizations, but there are unique processes that is distinct to libraries, as you are all aware. These include collection development, acquisitions, circulations, and cataloging, and then it funnels through to the policies and processes and procedures that govern these as well. Workflows can be used interchangeably with standard operating procedures or just procedures depending on where in the world the library is situated. With the pandemic and having in mind how to adjust and refocus, libraries should spend time to review how they are moving forward with these workflow processes. All these workflow processes involve one or the other form of social interaction with individuals. Now that most of us are working from home or are on a rotation-based format from the office, these processes may need to be rethink. When a process changes, the policies and procedures need to be adjusted as well, and they should be there to support these changes. Collection development, if the physical library and the physical resources no longer serves the purpose, the process needs to be adjusted. In the past, collection development policies may have made provision for only physical or print collections, and I have experienced a number of libraries having to revisit their collection development to include e-resources in recent times due to the pandemic. Along with that comes the change of acquisitions when one changes your collection development processes or procedures. Acquisitions generally include the evaluation, purchasing, renewal, license agreements, and tracking of print or either electronic resources, which you rather owned or subscribed to. We as librarians need to review the resources we acquire for our users based on the needs of the users. When new types of resources are being purchased, the workflow for acquisitions need to be set up as well. Often there are procurement policies in place that govern the purchases of resources. These processes may have made provision for physical material using paper trails of invoices, license agreements, or whatever the case may be of paper trails. And given the drastic change of how we as a business, we as librarians do our business, we need to rethink how we acquire our resources. And very often we have to sign quite a number of procurement documents or get signatories from senior managers before we can purchase those. Often those signatures are a track of paper trails. Now, the librarian circulation is another impact or another factor that is being impacted on how we do business. This is what it looks like in the past. There is a circulation desk, a long counter usually located at the main entrance of the library to carry out library circulation activities. It is the service point to register for the library card, to check out, renew, and return library materials. Library staff at the circulation desk also provides basic search and reference services in the use of library and the placement of information resources. Now, in modern times, librarians have put up self-help kiosks to offer the options for users or patrons to do all of those functions themselves. And that is if there were funds available to do so. With the pandemic, this has changed quite substantially, and online circulation for e-resources are managed by the user and the patron themselves. The usage is automatically harvested through the system, and I have seen a decline in print resources in my library, or a number of librarians who I spoke to have shared that with me as well. And as a librarian, my aim is to increase the use of resources. So my focus would now be on e-resource circulation to get better return on investment. And we will look at return on investment in a little while. If your library continue to circulate print resources, the workflow thereof need to be rethinked, and it need to adhere to all the COVID safety and regulations, rules and guidelines. And with modern technology or the new or latest library systems, electronic resource management, or the short thereof, ERM tools, libraries do not have to catalog that extensively any longer. The ERM system allows auto holdings updates and activations of subscribed or owned resources. If your library is still purchasing print resources, you need to address the workflow and handling of such resources to also adhere to the COVID rules and regulations. Once your library have made strides to adhere to the workflow processes, we can now start thinking of other factors to focus and adjust to. When libraries want to ride the wave of staying ahead of trends and adopting change, it is important to evaluate what resources are needed to service your users. The aim here is, of course, to stay relevant. I want to start by touching a bit on benchmarking. And what I can say is the benchmark exercise is a great way of identifying gaps. You can compare your institution with another institution which is similar to your institution size and, of course, the type of courses that your institution offer. It's also important to see what other ACRL reports or suggested trend reports states of where we are and what they come up with as a criteria to compare your institution with each other. You can also review your current collection and its collection development policies, prioritize your collection based on the gaps and the new policy. If your aim is to purchase more e-resources, then the collection development must support that. See which resources will offer the best return on investment. Now, a simple explanation of ROI, in short for return on investment, is the amount of funds spent versus the number of uses, and you can divide that and get a figure. But for some print resources, they sit very often for months and if not for years on the shelves without being utilized. When you speak about electronic resources, the important factor here is for return on investment, you can have access to a great number of electronic resources, and let's use books as an example. And of course, if you open up a demand-driven acquisitions model, you can then see exactly what resources are being used, and you only pay for what is being utilized. And that's a great way of cutting down or limiting your resources access so that you have a great return on investment for your resources. You can also have a selection criteria in place for the resources, and this should basically include the type of resources, the pricing, the format, the access model of an e-resource, and continue to evaluate even your evaluation criteria based on the user needs. Now, given the pandemic, it pushed most libraries to choose e-resources above print resources. Now, the big question here is, how do one move from a print to electronic collection? For me, it's important to evaluate the resources as we indicate in the previous slide. Set a criteria for the selection of resources in this case, which I use the example of books. And then this criteria need to include the price, the access model, and a number of other things which you can think of as a librarian. From my experience, I don't only choose the price and the model, the access model, but there are things like as well as from which publisher you would purchase the books and the number of copies you would purchase, and of course the pricing models based on what the publisher avails. Now, based on the selection criteria, one can then do a selection. The publisher will gladly assist with the print to electronic title match to see which books and journals can be replaced in e-format. Most publishers I worked with will allow discounts of e-resources if you own the print copy. Acquisitions models is important to be familiar with, and you can use PDA, which is patron-driven acquisitions models, DDA, which is a demand-driven acquisitions models, access to own ATO or EBA, which is evidence-based acquisitions models, or even subscriptions. If you're not familiar with these terminology, you can gladly contact me and I can explain all of these to you. Ebooks have various access models and differ from publishers. The most common ones are 1 user, 3 user, or unlimited, or a number of credits depending on which publisher you purchase your ebooks from. Your acquisitions model and access model should be incorporated in your criteria as well. Once you acquired the books, you need to market them for optimum use. And not only for books, you should market your e-resources or databases as well. Create awareness so your users can know you have access to these resources. Importantly, track the books, track the resources, track the databases to see how they are used. If usage is low, increase your marketing activity. Be in the face of the user. And these days, being in the face can be something like a post on social media or utilizing your website as a tool for marketing as well. We all face either budget cuts or lower budgets at our institution. The exchange rate fluctuations put even more strain on what we as libraries can purchase. In South Africa, particularly, SANLiC plays an integral role as a consortium, and prices are being monitored. If your institution are not part of a consortium, now may be a good time to get involved and enjoy those benefits of lower pricing options. Negotiations with vendors and publishers is also very helpful, and that can support you for having consistent pricing. And I'm certain publishers and vendors do want to keep your business, and they may keep their prices steady, which will then help you as a library to have a lower cost or a steady cost throughout the next year or two. Now, to wrap up, we had a look at a number of factors that influence how we deal with change, because either the pandemic or the trends caused by the current status quo. We looked at workflows, the need for librarian skill changes, the continuous evaluation of resources, marketing, budget allocations, and the adjustment from print to electronic resources. I'm continuously looking at the trends and usage of my library and note that there's definitely a higher demand for e-resources. My tips to you is keep on looking at the trends, collaborate with your sister institutions to expand your knowledge. Most publishers and vendors have marketing departments and are more than willing to share institution branded materials with you. Do not create your own as your partners to market. They have the resources and are willing to support you as a library to have the available marketing resources. Most publishers and vendors have dedicated trainers who can assist you as a librarian with the transition from print to electronic and train you on how to use these resources. These trainings can be offered to your users as well. Also, follow the public webinars offered by marketing leaders in the field, publishers and vendors, as they are here to give us as librarians the guidance on how to move forward. This will free you up to focus on getting your other services up to level to assist users and allow you to implement various new library e-services. You can reclaim your role back as a librarian by working smart and tap into the resources that is available to you. So this brings me to the end of the session. I want to thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Werner van der Walt, and I'll be co-presenting with Brenda Stolz. We are from Rhodes University Library in the Eastern Cape. And the topic of our conversation today is what e-resource librarians, which client services librarians knew. The crux of the matter is that especially if you talk to colleagues, there's a possible disconnect between ERM and other processes in the library and user services, and there's a negative impact potentially on client services, both in rendering the services and to effectively manage collections. So the paper examines some of the key issues that, if addressed, would improve and empower client services in rendering more effective services and provide frontline support. The crux of the matter is that language is an issue in libraries. The library environment is known for the use of acronyms, abbreviations, and jargon that seems foreign to many, even our own colleagues. And we've often had conversation about this in the library, and people asked us to please use different terminology. But tongue-in-cheek, incomprehensible jargon is the hallmark of the profession. Unfortunately, it is not of the hallmark of a conducive profession. Jargon is an expression of knowledge. Now, jargon is specialized terminology associated with a particular field or area of activity, as in the case of electronic resource management, for instance. It is the language of our environment. And we must recall that language is contextually and functionally dependent, and we don't always speak the same language. And what is the outcome of us not speaking the same language? As Pitoko and Justanified defines jargon as causing knowledge stickiness. This is where it's very difficult for knowledge or even standard information to be communicated or transferred between entities or colleagues. It also attributes to the way in which information is encoded. It leads to characterization of staff, and it influences staff behaviors. And we've seen this before, especially amongst the activities in our library, where because of knowledge stickiness, people are then seen as either being experts, or there's certain individuals that specifically don't want to respond to something because they might not have the right language or right knowledge pertaining to that area. So applying this theory to our own environment, we have to acknowledge that we are not always effective in knowledge transfer. That's mostly because of the area of specialization that's required in our academic libraries. And this is, again, due to the complexity of the environments. And specifically, I'm looking at electronic resources management and digital scholarship as being some of the most complex environments that we currently have to deal with. The results of this challenge is that knowledge is limited to a few individuals. All support often directed to those individuals, and that their knowledge about the environment is not diffused effectively. It also leads to an increase of or an unfair expectation on staff in terms of, because somebody's known for having certain skills or knowledge, that all queries or all support will be expected from that person. On the other hand, is because of a lack of understanding that certain staff cannot optimally perform certain activities. And potentially this negative impacts on our ability to render services effectively and efficiently. In terms of studies undertaken, it's already been 2 decades where it's been argued that our traditional knowledge needs to be augmented with technological knowledge. And we can see this specifically where the COVID-19 environment, in terms of study and work arrangements, forced us to rethink our traditional services and focus on virtual services. I don't know how many of you actually struggled, possibly last year and possibly this year, to actually render service effectively and without the relevant knowledge to assist, because we were forced out of our comfort zone or forced out of our traditional environments. And we can see this. So one of the most complex environments is the collection development when it comes to ebooks. So that's what we'll be using as an example in this study.
The academic library's mandate is to ensure that users' information needs are met. Consider for a moment the difficulty in this, where circumstances demand a change in how services are rendered, and combine this with the complexities of the environment. To illustrate this, I will be using the ebook environment, the needed knowledge and the possible impact this has on the end users. The COVID-19 period did not allow for much time to really investigate fully the various options and considerations to make complete informed decisions. When considering ebooks, the first challenge is to analyze the various procurement options. Is it better to work with an aggregator or buy directly from a publisher? What are the options, and to what extent does the various procurement tools, such as Gobi, assist in this process? Would packages or single title options be better? The question really is, what is meant by better, and for whom would the decision be better? Is the process better suited for the acquisitions unit, the ERM unit, user services, or, as it should be, the end user? A number of providers have strict limitations on ebook usage. For example, single user access versus unlimited access, or even hybrid access, such as limited simultaneous use. Now, under normal circumstances, as during term time, limited use may be feasible and financially desirable. But considering the shift of the academic project to a virtual environment, how do you ensure access to resources for vast numbers of students, especially in instances such as examinations, which may require classes running in the hundreds to access the same materials at the same time? Can we possibly negotiate with vendors to pay nominal limited fees, but for exam purposes, extend the access at a slight additional cost? Discoverability of these resources are paramount, but again, the challenge of the current authentication environment causes support challenges. It is critical for user services staff to know how users are accessing resources, from both the point of how they are trying to gain access to resources, as well as which method of authentication is supported by the resource. The current environment supports a combination of authentication methods, being the traditional IP authentication processes, proxy or VPN access for off-campus users, and now the recent migration to single sign-on, options such as via SAML, as supported by the South African Federated Identity Management Project, or SAFIRE for short. One area of great concern is the usability of the solutions proposed. As librarians, we might not always reflect on the end user experiences, especially where these solutions often include the assumption that factors such as electricity and internet connectivity are stable, as well as the assumption that hardware and software requirements are met. In addition, the user experience is also impacted by functionality. For example, digital rights management restrictions, limits on the amount of pages one can save or print or download per ebook. Can we say that we have considered all these factors in terms of the users, especially during the COVID period when users were studying at home? In addition, how do we effectively render support where solutions have diverse user interfaces aligned for different usage scenarios and user experiences, such as reader platforms and apps? All that has been mentioned does also impact on the costs associated with rendering these services, and requires a detailed understanding by all the relevant librarians to make informed decisions in terms of collection development and management. It is therefore critical that user services staff understand the context and the concepts, and to be able to reflect on these in terms of the user experience.
The conversation as outlined by Brenda indicates that the number of technological terms that's required to actually fully understand the environment. In order for us to ensure that our services are rendered effectively and efficiently, and we can optimally supply our users with meet the required needs, it is critical that the language of the environment be understood, and that the same language actually be understood by all in the library. So what do ERM librarians actually wish client services staff know? Is that we don't use technical terms or jargon unnecessarily. We are not able to tone it down, and we all need to speak the same language. How are we going to go about doing this? First of all, we suggest continual professional development, and this is obviously locality-based. We also suggest introductory sessions for new staff, especially orientation, where staff go around to each unit and all aspects of the job as it is entailed in a job profile is explained to the individual. We also suggest that the national curriculum focus on specific areas, and we also suggest that the glossary be developed and maintained that we can use across all the academic institutions and other libraries in South Africa. List of references, and thank you from both myself and Brenda from Rhodes University. Thank you.
Please join me in a virtual applause for our speakers. I think quite a lot was said, very, very interesting, and I'm looking at the discussion forum. People are itching to get a word in. So let me just take a step back quickly and recoup and tell you who your speakers were. Obviously, they introduced themselves, but I will just do a very quick introduction. I've introduced Tyler Shores to you earlier. Your second speaker was Lindiwe Suyiswapi. Obviously, we are very much familiar with her. She's she's at the helm of the University of Pretoria Library and has been there since 2020 as the Director of Library Services. Welcome, Lindiwe, albeit a bit belated. The next speaker that we had was Samantha Bennett, speaking about adapting librarian skills and workflows. And let me give you a little bit of her biography. She holds a Bachelor in Information Science from University of South Africa. She's worked at ProQuest, and she's also been a librarian at University of Stellenbosch in South Africa for a while. She has more than 18 years of experience as a librarian in the sector. The last two speakers that we just heard was very provoking. What e-resources librarians, which client services librarians knew, Wynand van der Walt and Brenda Scholz. And they are both, as they indicated to us, from Rhodes University. And Brenda has a Bachelor of Arts degree and a higher diploma in education from Rhodes University. She's subsequently obtained a Bachelor of Information Science, cum laude from UNISA, as well as an honors cum laude. Brenda has worked in various positions at Rhodes University. Wynand is currently busy with his PhD at KU Leuven, and he obtained his master's in IT from University of Pretoria. We are familiar with most of these speakers that I've just mentioned to you. And I know you can't wait to put questions to them. So let me ask you to direct your questions to our first speaker, Tyler. Any questions from the floor for Tyler?
There was one question I thought I would address while people are thinking from, shoot, I forgot who said it. Sorry. But it was about distractions and like, you know, in a way, do they increase engagement? So it's a good point. I just wanted to talk through a little bit about that further, just about engagement and distractions aren't necessarily polar opposites. Like, think of it more as like a continuum. From like a little bit of what I talked about in the recorded session, we do have built-in limits on our attention spans. It's different for everyone, depending on our background, depending on the types of tasks we usually do on a day-to-day basis. But some amount of distraction, I think, like when I showed the Pomodoro apps, that's not a bad way to go sometimes, depending on the task itself, because that is a built-in way to manage the ebb and flows of how our attention spans tend to go. In terms of, like, we might work for 10 or 15 minutes, we might take a break for 5 minutes, but just knowing that we have a finite amount of attention that we can devote to a task, at which point there might be diminishing returns, no matter how hard we're concentrating on that. It's like, yeah, so distractions can be a welcome break and actually increase productivity. I tend to think that distractions are different. It's different. There's different gradients of distraction, and it tends to vary from person to person, or even time of day. Some of us are just more distractible in the morning or in the evening based on our chronotype. Chronotype is basically, are we a morning person? Are we a night person? The time of day that we're usually most, we usually have some sense of when we're most productive. Like, we tend to be less distractible then. For me, it's evenings. That's when it's easier for me to focus and be less distracted. Certain things are more distracting than others. For some people, it might be an email in all caps, like, you know, with a, you know, subject line is like, oh no, my heart is racing. This might be something bad. For other people, it might just be a post on social media from someone that they care about, or something that's inflammatory. That can be very distracting for most of us. So it does depend. There's a lot more to say about that, but I'm trying to give like a just a little bit more of an answer to that question about distractions and engagement, I guess.
Thank you very much, Tyler. I note that you indicated that you would share some of the resources with us on Twitter.
Yes.
I must say, I don't know whether it's related to my age, but it's the first time that I've heard of anti-distraction apps. So thank you very much. I've certainly learned something today, and I will look up the Pomodoro app. Lindiwe, I know that you did, your paper centered on the survey that you did, and that was especially illuminating. I found illuminating the fact that you did a UX study during COVID times, and I was wondering how that was going to happen, and thankfully you explained that. I've seen some questions. I'm not sure whether you've seen any. Is there anything that you want to clarify while we still have you? Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Chair. I think the one question I'd like to maybe take up is around the feedback we received about unhappiness about our turnaround time. I think it's quite easy to receive positive feedback, but criticism, I think, although initially it's not nice to hear it, but I think it strengthens your response going forward. So obviously, we took it well, and we had to then, I think one of the things we did was to just revisit our netiquette, online etiquette with our staff. People must be mindful to say when they are out of the office, to make clear what their working hours are. And also, you know, we now had facilities of scheduling appointments online, and you find that at the end of the day, if you don't close it off, and people then think you are available. So I think it was good feedback we received, and it's just to encourage staff to be more mindful about attending to inquiries. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lindiwe. I have, well, let me say, Brenda and Wynand's presentation was very interesting. As much as Lindiwe said to us that silos came down, that we know there's an artificial wall between client services and the so-called backroom services. So their presentation featured on some of these things and key issues in their view that they think should be addressed. Could I ask them to elaborate a little bit more, or to touch on some of the questions that have come up from the floor?
Thank you, Lucille. Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you all for the very positive discussion. And I've been watching the discussion forum closely, and I think there's a lot of agreement in terms of what we've been saying, but I also understand that we have to be careful, and I think I've neglected to add this to our presentation. And I think Nikki and Larson alluded to it, that there's two sides to this conversation. One is the jargon we use within the library, and how do we ensure that it doesn't cause knowledge stickiness? But at the same time, how do you then support your end users whom you don't expect to understand this jargon? And so how do we really look at our communication, specifically our lip guides, our Facebook posts, etc., to make sure that what we need to communicate to them is actually in a language that they understand. So we also have to then look at user services as being a translation service between technical services and the end user. But in order to translate, you have to understand the language. And we've picked it up that we tend to use language with assumption that people understand, and I myself, I think, extremely guilty of it, and as well as at times I would not indicate, sorry, I don't understand what you've been saying. What does this term mean? And I think we need to stop and reflect that each of us have an area of speciality, our area of focus, and therefore we need to stop each other and then just ask the right questions. What does this mean? And can I actually reword this differently? So I think in the everyday conversations that we have, and when we talk with our colleagues, debates, etc., that's where we have to start and stop each other. So please, let us start asking the right questions so that we can communicate effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Bennett. Sorry, I'm running ahead in my mind trying to get to Samantha. Vainan, thank you very much. Brenda, is there anything you wanted to add?
Unfortunately, Brenda
Okay.
had technical difficulties.
Yeah, okay. No, that's fine. Samantha, I'm sure you think that I've left you out. I kept you for last. Your paper elicited quite a response on the forum, I saw. And you started off with saying the only constant is change. And I found it quite interesting that you said over and above, of course, meeting these changes and adapting, you touched on things such as our workflows, our policies and our procedures, and then you also spoke about the circulation services and how that's impacted when we go the virtual route or online route. Once again, is there anything that you would like to elaborate on or any questions that you think you may want to answer that you've picked up from the forum?
Thank you, Lucille. I think I addressed most of the questions. The only statement that I could probably make is I've seen someone said that it's the role of the e-resources as well as the systems librarians these days to take care of all the technology and all of the things. Technology. From my point of view, that has changed because everything is online these days. You as a librarian, whether you were a circulation librarian or whether you were a cataloging librarian or whether you are a liaison librarian, it's your responsibility these days to skill yourself up to become that stand-in e-resources librarian. Even though we as e-resources librarian usually stand in the gap for taking on the responsibility of looking after the resources, if you don't know as a librarian where to find them in an e-environment, if you cannot answer the regular questions about where to find resources, how to service clients, all of those things, because everything has become online. If you cannot do that, you need to change, you need to rethink how you go about. And I think the best part for me having to being in this process was prior to COVID-19, my institution that I previously worked for moved to 100% virtual, and I happened to be the project manager for that. And that has given me the competitive advantage of looking at things differently because we had to rechange or rethink how the usual circulation desk librarian roles would change. So if COVID-19 has brought that about now and pushed us into going forward, my previous institution was at a more competitive advantage dealing with that because they were at the edge of it already by looking at the details of it. So it's definitely something mind change that one has to go about, but also to keep looking out for the trends, to put yourself out there and be open-minded in addressing the changes that comes along with being an e-resources librarian or a systems librarian, and now a librarian who has to service its clients in a virtual or an e-environment. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samantha. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the speakers. This was very thought-provoking, certainly gave us food for thought, especially going back into the work environment. In conclusion, now comes the good thing. There's a winner again. I've been watching people ratcheting up the points. I'm sure we've got quite a few high points over there. But our spot prize winner for the product review session is, drumroll, Abigail Sharoma. Well done. You win a spot prize. Thank you so much. We're going to take a couple of minutes break, and then we're moving on to the next and the final session with our panel review. Thank you, everybody. No break, I believe, because we are running late. So I'm going to introduce the panel members to you in a short while. Thank you, everybody. Okay, so our last session for the afternoon is a reflective exercise where we're going to wrap up what we've been listening to the whole morning, well, afternoon, let's put it the afternoon sessions, and reflect on what some of the papers suggested, etc. And we've got 3 directors from libraries in South Africa that will form the panel. So let me introduce you to them. Our first director is Dr. Neerputh. She's the Director, Library Services at the University of the Western Cape. She's the current chairperson of the Committee of Higher Education Library South Africa, that is CHALSA. Over and above being known as Dr. Neerputh, the rest of us know her as Shirlene. And Shirlene's passion lies in leading and enriching the university library with embedded librarianship principles, responsiveness to the rapid disruption and transformation in a global pandemic in our time. Our second director is Dr. Connie Bitso, currently the Director of Libraries at the University of Fort Hare. Prior to this position, she was a senior lecturer at the Library and Information Studies Center at the University of Cape Town, UCT. And she has grassroots experience of university school partnerships, and for many years has been working in higher education as a librarian and a research active academic. Our last speaker, so I covered the 2 roses, the 2 ladies. The last one is the male, and Matt Moyo. He's currently the Chief Director, Library and Information Services at Northwest University, South Africa. His experience in the LIS field spans more than 25 years. Dr. Moyo has also lectured in information science field for more than 5 years. He holds a doctoral degree from University of Fort Hare. His research interests include information literacy, open science, user behavior, amongst others. He's very passionate about mentorship and capacity building. So welcome to our 3 panel members. And they're going to reflect on some of the papers that we heard today, and where possible, perhaps indicate examples of best practice either in the institution or wider. So let me start off with Dr. Shirlene Neerputh.
Thank you, Lucille. Good day, colleagues. Good day, SANLiC members, at the board, and all the participants. It's wonderful to be with you at the SANLiC conference. Yes, it's a very different conference altogether. And these are definitely challenging and interesting times. So we were given a very short brief to perhaps look up upon reflections and on the sustainability of and the relevance of academic libraries. And I'm going to give you a very quick highlight about the day and what is happening in libraries at present. So I did say it is an extremely challenging time for all library leaderships, for all librarians. And in this pandemic, the most important critical thing is humaneness. And I heard throughout the sessions today is how to be kind. And also how to be kind. I think as librarians, we've always been kind. I want to say that the COVID-19 pandemic has certainly disrupted all aspects of the social, economic, and technological spheres within higher education, within libraries. Going into a little bit into the past, the student protests of 2015, 2017 challenged the unequal access to education, whereas the pandemic highlighted the persistent inequalities prevalent in South African and global higher education sectors. So while there has been widespread adoption of hybrid teaching, learning, and research and online modules of our university faculties and student communications, these inequalities manifested by the persistent digital divide, differentiated access to resources and connectivity, and the limited funding for higher education. All of these things, none of the South African higher education were really prepared for, neither were libraries. But the good thing is, as we are very resilient, is that academic libraries transition very well, in some cases leading the academic counterparts in the online environment. And that was mainly due to academic librarians at the forefront of technological change, being agile and responsive to their environments. So within the day's recordings of the keynote speakers, I want to reflect upon Professor Coupe's suggestions he made about sectorial collaborations. And one of the critical things he did say is that we as South African higher education need to rethink. And this is the time where library directors need to reset our priorities and look at how we engage as collaborators, as partners in the university and external to the university. So critical to the disruption is solutions that have opportuned themselves. And one of the critical solutions for me came around us being in leadership. How do you become adaptive leaders? How do you respond to an environment that you have never encountered before? So it is an interesting, we live in interesting times, we live in a scary time, we live in an uncertain time, but certainly the opportunities are now at the forefront. One of the critical things that resonated with me as the library director was what Abdullah had mentioned, the cycles of disruption. And under the cycles of disruption, he brought about the four critical principles, the deepened organizational awareness. And that is something that we as academic leadership, as academic librarians in the sector must take good note of. Deepened organizational awareness. Do we know how we're responding to our academics, to our researchers, to our students, and to the communities that we serve? What are the shifts we are making as academic librarians? How do we reset, reimagine librarians and the new role and the value of our libraries in the online environments? And the other principle was based on reimagine your business model. So when I look at reimagine the business model, and this is very pertinent to our services, our resources, we're pushing the open access agenda, yes. We're looking at collaborating, sharing of research, housing the research data management, looking at embedding the library in the teaching, learning, the research programs. Are we doing it well? Are we contributing to quality? One of the critical things in the disruptive times is around AI. Are we AI as librarians? Are we looking at business models that build around that perspective? And the other issue he brought about is amplify innovation. How do we go around amplifying innovation, creating innovative library services to respond to the 2020-2021 Save the Academic Year? And in this one, I would like to acknowledge our dedicated librarians who have served academic libraries and been responsive and agile in the online environment. So much so that we have pushed the frontiers of our service and made sure that we embed our value in higher education. So within the Amplify innovation came a culture of innovation. Are we as academic librarians leveraging strategies for advancing ourselves? How do we unskill ourselves? And my colleagues would cover a little bit about librarians' new digital skills, new skills of technology and teaching and learning. in their presentation. And the other critical thing he talked about is leadership. Now, when I talk about leadership, I'd like to say that leadership resonates with each and every one of us as librarians, as your line managers, as directors of the library. Leadership is within yourself. Now more than ever, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen how important it is to manage ourselves, to lead ourselves, to be responsible citizens. And that is something that I would like to say, find the human moments and let the magic of building and enhancing our professionalization of academic libraries contribute to the magic of student success and academic success in the institutions and beyond. One of the critical key things about academic libraries and libraries around the world is the fact that we contribute to lifelong learners. The pandemic has really proven that this is the time of the lifelong learner, the quality graduate. How we as an academic librarian are contributing or making a difference to the lifelong learner or to the quality graduate in your institution. How do librarians harness the unprecedented level of collaboration and become responsive to technologies, to digital access and skills, and contribute to the fundamental principles of equity and social justice in our society? South African higher education needs you more than ever. And this is the time where libraries and librarians really need to shine. We are in a disruptive environment. It has created challenges, but equally has come with it opportunities which we need to embrace and move forward in pushing the value of academic libraries in the institutions.
Thank you very much, Charlene. Sorry to cut you short. I still have two other speakers.
Okay.
Dr. Connie wants to speak about how do we prepare for this new environment that we're operating in terms of skills, etc. Connie?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lucille, and thank you very much to Dean for cutting and covering the issues that were covered in the morning during the keynote address. I think one of the things that we can think of or that were highlighted is the diversity, the differences in lived experiences and the different backgrounds and contexts of our users and our stakeholders and especially our students. As we are trying to understand information behavior and user behavior, I think we should be understanding it or approaching it from multiple perspectives because the playing field is not level, the terrain is not homogeneous, it is that one that is multiple, that is characterized by multiple features. Professor Cooper touched on three critical literacies that of going forward, digital information and critical media literacies. And I think to me that instigated a memory of one of the concepts that we learned in, I think it was in 2019 in a conference on information literacies, where we now have to be thinking of the meta concept. The meta concept that we know from into metadata, into meta-analysis, and bring it down to meta literacies. As we move forward with the knowledge and understanding and appreciating the diversity that is there in our users, we have to be thinking of infusing and introducing the meta literacies. I think one of the things also that came out strongly from Ruth's session was about understanding and looking into e-learning librarianship. How are we supporting our students in an online mode for their information richness and competencies? I think this is quite important that as we move forward and as this pandemic hits us, yes, fair enough, we're already in the electronic spaces and in the digital environments, But the fact, as Shelin highlighted, and as the keynote and various aspects were highlighted in the morning, we have got a legacy, we have got a history, and within that history, we know that the level and the inequalities are there and clearing. And some of the things that are happening in our country, the recent unrest, civil unrest, and also a lot of like issues that are around us that we always have to be observing at all times. I think we have to be thinking of monitoring, as we have done before, monitoring user information behavior while we are reimagining our services and our offerings. We need to be engaging publishers on reading analytics data of our students. This was, I think, what we picked also from Samantha's presentation. And then we have to be relating students' readership and aptitude for and use of the technology. And one of the things that also featured is that the theories of information behavior, such as Brenda Devon's sense-making model, is still pertinent, as we saw that it was featuring in Abdullah's disruption framework. And within, as we are looking into our continuing professional development and upskilling ourselves in emerging areas in the information ecosystem, we have to evaluate our resources, evaluate our spaces, look at our processes, workflows, and standard operating procedures and service structures to review our collection developments, to look into our acquisition models and monitor usage. I think one of the things that we came out clearly and strongly is the language and the knowledge and how we acquire knowledge and communicate amongst us as different teams, and also communicate with our users and the publishers. I think it's also came out quite strongly in Vainand's presentation. And as we are working and navigating ourselves and in this unknown and ever dynamic and changing information landscape, we should think of psychosocial support that we as practitioners need and the user community around us need. As we continue to be agile and think of solutions, we need to identify opportunities, because there are really the opportunities out there that we can harness. And we have to make decisions in this dynamic information service world constantly. So, which is really characterized by digital disruptions. So one of the things that came out strongly is that we continue to be very patient and kind to each other. But of utmost importance, we need to know ourselves. We need to know where we are. We need to know where we need to go and who to collaborate with and partner with, so that these people that we collaborate with have to be people that have got similar characteristics. Institutions are different and they're at different spaces and in terms of resources and all facets. And we have to be considering around us, partner with those people that are having similar characteristics to us, and know what is happening around the world. Look at the trends, the ACR trends, and what is happening in our countries. And first of all, and of most importance, and let us be aware of the pestle realities, the political landscape, the economic climate, the social, the technological, the environmental and legal realities that are around us. And we have to be smart and harness opportunities and navigate this changing terrain, which has got several linings and opportunities, while we do also understand that there are challenges there. I think these are some of the issues that I've picked up, and a lot was said, and it was a very fruitful sessions and very fruitful deliberations throughout, and there's quite a lot that I'm sure everyone has noted and will carry with them going forward. Thank you very much, Lucille and colleagues.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bitso. Last but not least, we're asking Matt Moyo to come on, and he's going to reflect, especially in terms of the impact of social media and digital reading behavior, distraction or anti-distraction apps. And yeah, let me leave it to him. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hope you can hear me, and
yes,
I think I want to optimize on this benefit of speaking at the very last, given that my two colleagues, Shalin and Connie, have touched on most of the things that I also wanted to reflect on. I have been given a different dimension, as Lucille has just indicated, in terms of looking at the impact of these shifts and changes within our sector. I also realized that the topics that have been presented here since we started during the course of the day interlinked, and as such, I cannot avoid referring to some of those presentations that came in much earlier, in addition to the two that I'm going to be focusing on. In fact, to be more specific, I'll be focusing on the two presentations presented by Tyler Shores, who spoke about distraction or engagement, social media, libraries, digital reading behavior, and of course our colleague Lindiwe Soizwapi, who spoke about renewed mission for engagement to enhance discovery of information resources with a special focus on the University of Pretoria. And I must say to Lindiwe, this presentation had a special focus on the University of Pretoria, but it did in quite a bigger way appeal to all of us, and I can say that with a lot of confidence. That was quite an interesting survey indeed. So in terms of the two disasters that I would want to focus on, starting with the Fees Must Fall protests around 2015 to 2016, and then fast forward to 2019, whereby we started then to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic. I think these are the two disasters that I would want to focus on in terms of this review. Of course, there could be other disruptors outside the disasters, like we always have to contend with advances in technology, which is quite dynamic, and also the pedagogical innovations and changes, as the learned professor referred to, the Vice Chancellor from University of Pretoria, and of course the shifts and changes in the research landscape. And the big question that we need to answer is, how do we then respond to these changes? And I'm sure the colleagues that have spoken before me, Shalene and Connie, touched on some of the things that we need to do. And these issues were quite prominent from what we had ever since the beginning of this conference. Staff skills going forward will be very critical in terms of us being called in to evaluate our current skills and also take stock of what the future would look like in terms of future skills. And of course, we would also want to constantly review and revise, revisit our services so that we always stay on top of our game. And of course, our technologies, the tools that deliver services to our users, are they in conformity, in compliance with the expectations of 21st century students and users in general? And of course, post-COVID-19, we would also want to revisit issues like our infrastructure, our spaces. Right now, we're still sitting with some spaces that were closed at the beginning or at the outset of COVID-19. How will they look like after COVID-19? Are we going to retain such spaces in their current shape and form? Then our information resources, I think we have heard a lot about the shift from print books to e-books, which was really a major issue from the beginning of this pandemic, and it continues to be a major issue in our libraries. Then, of course, we need, as Connie has referred to, we need also to evaluate and monitor, put in place some monitoring mechanisms in terms of our services. And we need also to review our communication channels. We need to occupy the spaces where our young users are. And in this case, as Tyler has put it, we need to employ social media and ensure that we are quite visible on our social media platforms. And I would also advise that you need not to have too many social media platforms. You would rather have just a few, and you make sure that those few that you have are very effective in delivering your communication. And having said this, I think we need also to look at our communication policies, our guidelines for information resources, our guidelines for services, so that these are in line with the demands of the changing landscape. So in addition to this, what do we then need to do? I think as library and information workers, we need to be flexible in our approaches to service delivery. We need to think out of the box, and we need to be agile. We need also to acclimatize with the changes that are taking place in our environment. We have heard this morning that librarians provide reliable information, and we should be trusted for providing or countering misinformation and disinformation, which has really gripped the world, particularly during this pandemic period. And now to sum up, the prefix "re" is what holds promise for us in the LIS sector. We need to reflect, we need to review, we need to rethink, and we need to reshape our services. We need to reconsider and renew our catalog of services so that they will continue to be reliable, and they will continue to be on demand by our users. We need to re-engineer and repurpose some of our spaces. I've already indicated that post-COVID-19, we will have to revisit some of our current spaces that we have. But above all, we need to reinvigorate. The list of these could really be endless. But having reviewed the presentations of the day, I thought these are some of the things that we would need to pursue going forward as the LIS sector. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moyo. Oops, okay. So, colleagues, we've come virtually to the end, but before I let you go, I have to announce that we're going to have a happy hour. But before I take you to happy hour, I'm allowing 2 questions. If you have any questions for our esteemed panel members, once again, thank you so much, Dr. Bitso, Dr. Neer, Dr. Moyo. Any questions from the floor? No, I think the questions have been answered. In summary, I would just like to say something that really resonated with me was Professor Kupe's statement that the librarians or libraries were the unsung heroes during this period. You know, we are always seen as the first adopters of technology, and this came strongly to the fore when all the universities had to migrate from face-to-face to online teaching. And we were at the forefront of ensuring that information resources were available in whatever format for our communities. If there are no further questions, then I need to announce happy hour. And the happy hour today is the spot prize winner for session 2. And that is Teresa Stuman. Please join me in congratulating her. At this juncture, I would like to say thank you to our prize sponsors. IEEE Explore, Digital Live are so thankful. And thank you for staying right to the end. Before I let you go, tomorrow you can join us again at 12 o'clock on the same link and on the same login. Have a pleasant evening. Thank you, panel members, and thank you, everybody. Well done.
Goodbye.
Good evening. Have a pleasant evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucille. Thank you for chairing our session. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You're welcome. Thank you.